Hello, my name is Stephen Smith. I'm here in conversation today with Nimrod Zigi Ariav and with Jordana Cutler. It's a pleasure to have you both here, and thank you for taking the time to join us from Israel. Ziggy, maybe I could start by talking to you, first of all, for a little while, just about the fact that you and I met several years ago. We were introduced, and I was very interested in learning about your story. And was very interested also in perhaps taking the testimony of your Holocaust experience. And in that first conversation, you said to me, well, I'm not sure that I want to do that because I don't want to become a Holocaust man. What did you mean by that?
And I'm not. And I'm not. Still.
And what is a Holocaust man, and why didn't you want to give your testimony in that context?
Went through that World War II. That was a long time ago. I decided to come to Israel, and that decision was a hard one for me because at a certain time I thought that I would stay not Zigi Ariav and not Ariav because my name was Zidon. And the first name wasn't Zigi, it was Shalom. But things worked out differently. And it happened what it happened. And then I made the decision to come to Israel. And it was quite a hard one for me. At home, my mother was a Zionist. She was also in the mine, but what was it, the Zionist organization first meetings, I think it was one of the mine, but she was over there and so on. But I came here, went straight to the army, spent 7 years in the army, and then started working in Israel Aircraft Industries. And with this, and I didn't feel like going back on that. I didn't want to give the testimony, you know it very well, we had a lot of discussions about it, but somehow I think I was convinced, not exactly by you, but I was convinced after one thing that happened to me. I buried my father and myself with my brother. I had a twin brother. I buried him in 1942 together with 149 people, a total of 150 people. After the war, and after quite a long time that I didn't want to talk about it, not at home, and my wife was French, and she came to Israel. She was also survived by a French family, Christian family, and then came back home, and her parents survived, and we did not discuss that thing at all. Actually, the first time that I discussed with my sons what happened here was in 1988, where I went to Warsaw and my two sons were studying in the States. One was in Santa Barbara and the other one was in, what's the name of the university area? And the other one was in Stanford. And I invited them in 1988 to Warsaw. And then we spent 3 or 4 days together, and I talked and they listened. And at the same time, at the end, I said, let's go look where my father and your grandfather is buried. I looked for it 2 years, couldn't find it. And then they told me, why don't you ask? And I couldn't make myself ask because I should have known where it is, but I didn't. I went to the mayor of the town and told him I am the grandson of Shanyanta. He immediately knew that. That was my grandparent that I never met him. He died the year that I was born. And he told me, when I told him what I'm looking for, he says, "Come, I will show you." This was a point that changed me a little bit. And
So from
changed
that
me.
time on, you kept going back to Belzhice, is that correct? To the place of your father's burial, and that really
But
connected
there,
you back to
but there. And I think that at that time I realized that I waited too long without talking about it, and with who I didn't know with whom to talk. First of all, I did it with my two sons, and then I started thinking that I should do something about it. And of course, I made that thinking, where you were over there, you saw it. And from that time on, the whole family of mine met in Belzhice for commemoration. I built a new uh, cemetery. That was now my cemetery, not mine, belonged to the town, but that was what I took care of.
For the benefit of our audience, Ziggy found the burial place of his father that he and his twin brother had, where they'd buried him, and built a memorial in Belzhice, Poland. And each year the family returns there. And it was a real privilege, Ziggy, to be with you and your sons and their families to go and visit the burial place of your father. After that, we did do a testimony together, and I'm just going to play a clip from the testimony now to show what your Shoah Foundation testimony looks like.
I know from my aunt that survived, she was standing near my father, how he died. My father told us before that he is not going to any concentration camps, and he had poison with him. When he took that, standing there, that poison, an Ukrainian, because in that action, there was maybe one German officer. The rest were Ukrainians, Lithuanians. These were murderous bastards. Maybe one German was there. So the Ukrainian came to him and said, well, you don't have to do that, I'll help you, and shot him on the spot. After they left town, we came back together, saw all the people who died, and we brought them to the cemetery. And there's a Jewish law that says that all people who die the same day should be buried together and not in separate graves. And my brother, myself, a lot of young kids, and whoever survived, we buried in the common grave 150 people. My father is the first on the right, looking down on it, on the right, the first one. This stayed with me.
Jordana, I'm going to come to you just for a second now. We're seeing here a testimony that Ziggy gave using, latest technology, streamed on the internet, and as head of policy for Facebook in Israel and for the Jewish diaspora. What does it mean that we are inheriting all of these, digital stories that we can share with the world?
Well, first, I just want to say it's really a privilege to be here with you, Ziggy, and to be a part of this testimony every time that it gets watched and relived. It's really an honor, and it's very moving. And so, Stephen, to your question, I think it's really incredible. And I think especially now, since the year of COVID, we understand the power that we can have using different types of technology to share these stories. And Facebook is part of that. And the platforms that we have, whether it's Instagram, WhatsApp, or Facebook, or Oculus, which we use, by the way, to give a virtual reality tour of a place like the Anne Frank House, really help us to kind of share these stories and make sure they live on. But I also see them really as a gateway to get people who might be on one platform to another platform, whether it be the Shoah Foundation, to Yad Vashem, to other places that we work with these bodies of testimony. And I think it's really important that what we try to do is springboard, I would say, this year of uber technology use that people are in, to make sure that we get these testimonies seen by as many people as possible, and people that maybe didn't know that they were out there and really would be interested in seeing them. And I think that's really the unique opportunity, is how to get them to people that might not already be interested, or might not understand that they're interested.
Facebook's been somewhat in the spotlight over the last few years on the fact that you allowed Holocaust denial on the platform. I think that policy has changed now. I'd love you to tell us, update us on that. How has that change been implemented, and what are the opportunities then after that change to start to disseminate testimonies like Ziggy's that really help to inform the public about what really happened?
Please. Thank you. I think that the changes that we've made over the last 6 months are really big in trying to be a part of the fight against anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial online. And as you mentioned, in October, we made a big change to our hate speech policy to remove any Holocaust denial or distortion content from Facebook. But again, we don't think that removing that content is enough to try to combat the problems that we're seeing around the world. And so we're trying to springboard from the policy change that we made to also make sure that we're really taking an active role as Facebook in Holocaust remembrance and education. And one of the ways that we're doing that is when people now search for content on Facebook, for either content about the Holocaust or Holocaust denial, is to encourage them to visit a site that's run by UNESCO and the World Jewish Congress called aboutholocaust.com, and encourage them to get actual facts about the Holocaust. But it doesn't really stop there. I think really once we've taken the Holocaust denial and distortion off of Facebook, when people are looking for it, we make sure that they get accurate information. And now I think the question is, how can we use the power of our platform to get these kinds of testimonies and stories to as many people as possible? And that's one thing that we can do. With the size of our platforms, we have the ability to reach so many different people across the world in so many different languages. And that's why I'm really excited to really focus in 2021 on partnerships with organizations on how to get those voices out as much as possible. What can we do as a company to help voices like Ziggy's and many, many others get heard? The ones that no longer can speak and are recorded in your archives, and the people who are still alive and can still share those stories. In the time, as I mentioned, of Corona, we can't always do everything in person that we might have done before. But what we can do is via technology get together and make sure that the survivors can have their stories heard by people in real time. And I think that's really important for us moving forward.
Well, thank you for all you're doing on that. We'll come back in a second. Ziggy, in our first conversation, you told me that you didn't want to give a testimony. Then in a later conversation, you agreed to come to Los Angeles to do a very unique testimony, by which you spent 5 days answering hundreds and hundreds of questions in a project called Dimensions in Testimony. And you're also the first person, I think, to be filmed holographically answering questions in 2 languages, both in English and in Hebrew. What was it like for you to do that testimony in Los Angeles?
I knew Los Angeles before coming to see you over there. I used to come to Los Angeles to Douglas airplanes over there, quite a lot of times. What it meant to me, it meant to remember, and maybe, if I tell the story, people will believe it, because I speak not from a piece of paper, I speak from my memory, and hopefully I still have it.
You answered hundreds of questions that week, and those questions are now available for people to be able to view and experience, so that in future generations of young people can ask you questions like they might do in a school today. I'm just going to give a short demonstration of dimensions in testimony, and I might even stretch my few sentences in Hebrew as well, so we can see you both in English and in Hebrew. This is Zigi Ariav answering questions as part of Dimensions in Testimony. I'm just going to say hi to him in Hebrew. Shalom.
Shalom.
מה שלומך?
אני בסדר, מה נשמע?
Tov, tada. Now I'm going to switch, if it's okay, Ziggy, I'm going to switch over to English, because I've now stretched my Hebrew. And we're going to go to ask you, where do you live?
I'm living in Tel Aviv, Israel.
Do you have any grandchildren?
Yes, I have 5 grandchildren. It is Mo, Idan, Michael, Daniel, and Maya.
After all that you've been through, do you have hope for the world?
Hope. Hope for what? Just hope. Yes, I think that from time to time, I hope that something is going to be, or something is going to happen. It's 2 different things. But I don't live on that. It's a thought.
Toda rabba.
תודה רבה שבאת, מקווה שחידשתי משהו.
So Ziggy, you said that you wanted to ensure that it was remembered. You have subsequently been going to schools and universities, places to tell your story. What has it been like for you to now go into the public in Israel and tell your story in person to young people?
Listen, I didn't go to the public. I went to schools. And actually, I went to the school where my daughter-in-law is a principal. And I talked to the kids that next year or next time they go to the army. That means youth 17, 18. Then I talked in Israel, I talked to the people in Israel aircraft industries. They invited me every year to tell about my life over there. And it so happens that I used to be the president of that company once a time also. Then I did it in Poland, in Polish, in schools. And did it in two places, in Nożyce and in Lublin. Lublin is the place where I was born.
So really what you've been doing is putting your time and energy into making sure that the ignorance that there is about the Jewish world, Jewish history and identity, that you've been providing opportunity through your testimony and through your programs to try and inform that. It seems to me, Jordana, that there's a role that we can play in our online world to try and sort of provide this, deficit of information and the ignorance that we see, to provide real content for people. How do you think that we can, as those of us who are on social media or just part of the digital world today, can help to, deal with this misinformation through the way in which we share our stories or we communicate with others? Are there particular strategies that we should think about?
Well, it's a really good point because as just listening to what Ziggy is saying, it's not enough just to remove things, Holocaust denial and distortion. I think the fight against anti-Semitism is a big part of what he's saying. The general misunderstanding about who the Jews are and where those kinds of misunderstandings about a people are can lead to hate and these kinds of actions. And so I'm, first of all, very proud of the steps that Facebook has taken to remove this kind of hate speech against Jews. But secondly, I think it's more than just trying to get content out to people. It's really an active conversation with people that has to be done very differently around the world. So Facebook Inc. can come and say, we're going to remove content and we're going to redirect people to content. But I think that it's really important on a local level that Facebook helped to empower people that understand the local communities and the issues that they're facing. So the stories that we were just hearing about things that might be happening in modern day Poland might be very different than what's happening in Thailand or on the continent of Africa or from somewhere in the United States on the East Coast and the West Coast. Everywhere is very different. And the young people, especially the huge percentage of people that don't know anything about the Holocaust or maybe have never met a Jew in their life, is going to be different. And so what I hope to do is to help to empower those local communities to use our platform to get the right message about both remembrance and education out. One of the things that we're doing in Israel, for example, is trying to work with different organizations. And as you know, Stephen, the Shoah Foundation is one of them, to try to get those voices out to as many people as possible. Obviously, it's just as important for Israeli young people to hear these stories, but they don't necessarily need the same messaging as a young person in Poland today. It might seem obvious that an Israeli teen already knows these stories and is learning about it in school, but I think, as we all know, there's a lot more that we can do and ways that we can touch them. And so I am very proud that the Facebook Israel office is working very hard on a local level to get the Israeli voices of survivors out, to make sure that Israelis know what they can do to kind of ensure that remembrance and education continues not just in Israel, but globally. But my colleagues are doing that in France and in Germany and the United States and many other places that we operate. And so I think the goal here is to take what's happening on the local level and to use technology to springboard to get to as many people as possible to make sure that they can activate and do something with that information as opposed to just being a passive viewer.
Yeah, thank you for that, John. We were discussing the fact that among the 55,000 testimonies of the Shoah Foundation, there's over 6,000 in Hebrew and about 8,500 that were taken in Israel. And of course, they are part of the life of the community in Israel and belong there. But we also have thousands of testimonies in Polish that were taken in Poland. And I think your point about the fact that they can play different roles in different places is a really important one. So we're going to put on the screen here the link that you can follow to find the Shoah Foundation's archive so you can watch the testimony of Zigi Ariav. And keep an eye out later this year for Yom HaShoah. We will be launching the Zigi Ariav testimony in Hebrew at the Shoah Foundation so that you will be able to learn from him and ask questions of him. I'd like to thank you, Zigi, for all that you've done to leave for all of us your words of wisdom and your story for the future. And Jordana, for all that you're doing to ensure that the stories of the survivors of the Holocaust are heard in Israel and around the world so that we can prepare ourselves for the future in which the voices of the survivors continue to be our guides in whatever we have ahead of us. So thank you so much, Jordana and Zigi.